There's a moment that happens in almost every long-term relationship, friendship, or family, and it usually arrives quietly. You're listening to someone tell a story you've heard before, except this time, a few details have changed. Nothing dramatic, just a number that's different, a timeline that doesn't quite line up, a reason that sounds slightly more flattering than the one you remember. And for a second, you tell yourself it's nothing. You probably do this more often than you'd like to admit, brushing past these small inconsistencies because confronting them feels heavier than letting them go. But what if these aren't random slips? What if they're the visible edge of something much more deliberate, something the person themselves may not even fully recognize they're doing? That's what I want to explore with you today, because constant lying isn't really about dishonesty in the way most people think. It's about control. And underneath that control is a story far older and far more human than we usually give it credit for. So let's actually name what's happening here, because there's a difference between someone who lies occasionally under pressure and someone for whom lying has become a structure, almost an architecture they live inside. Psychologists sometimes use the term habitual deception, and at its more extreme end, things like pathological or manipulative lying. But I don't want to get lost in clinical labels right now. I want to talk about the lived experience of it, because that's where the real understanding happens. It helps to draw a clear line here, because most of us lie sometimes, and that's simply part of being human. You tell a friend their haircut looks great when it really doesn't. You say you're almost there when you haven't actually left the house yet. These small social lubricants rarely cost anyone anything, and they usually come from a wish to protect someone else's feelings rather than to control them. What we're talking about today is a different category entirely. It's not occasional, it's not really about sparing someone else, it's persistent. It serves a deeper psychological function, and over time, it starts to reshape not just individual conversations, but the entire emotional climate of a relationship. Picture him for a second. He's not a cartoon villain twisting his mustache, plotting how to deceive everyone around him. He's the colleague who always has a slightly more impressive version of events, the partner whose explanations for being late never quite add up, but are delivered with such calm certainty that you start doubting your own memory instead. The friend who exaggerates just enough that you can never quite call it a lie, but never quite call it the truth either. He's not lying because he enjoys cruelty. He's lying because somewhere along the way, the truth started to feel unsafe to him. And maybe you know someone exactly like this. Maybe you've spent years quietly collecting these inconsistencies, never adding them up into a full picture, because doing so would mean admitting something uncomfortable about a person you care about. That hesitation, that reluctance to name what you've been seeing is actually one of the most common threads in this entire dynamic, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we go further. Here's what I think most people miss about chronic lying.
It rarely starts as a strategy to harm anyone. It usually starts as a survival skill. Somewhere in this person's history, often early on, telling the truth led to punishment, ridicule, or the withdrawal of love. Maybe a parent reacted with rage to honest mistakes, so a child learned that the safest path forward was to construct a version of reality that kept the peace. Maybe vulnerability was met with mockery, so admitting weakness became unbearable. Over time, lying stopped being a choice made in any single moment and became the quiet operating system running underneath everything else. This is the part where the picture starts to deepen, because once you understand lying as a control mechanism rather than a moral failing, the behaviors around it start to make a lot more sense. So let's walk through how this actually shows up, moving from what's easiest to spot all the way down to what's much harder to see, even for the person living it. The first thing you'll usually notice is how smooth it all sounds. I've sat across from people like this, and what strikes me every time isn't hesitation, it's fluency. There's no stumbling, no nervous pause, just a story delivered with the same calm confidence, whether it's true or not. He doesn't sweat through the small inconsistencies because in his mind, the story isn't really a lie. It's a more comfortable version of events that he's already convinced himself of. Psychologically, this connects to something researchers call cognitive ease in deception, where repeated lying actually reduces the emotional friction that normally accompanies dishonesty. The brain adapts. What once felt like a violation starts to feel like just another sentence. You may have experienced this yourself, that strange moment where someone's story is delivered so smoothly that you start questioning your own doubts instead of theirs. That's not an accident. That fluency is doing real psychological work, both for him and on you. From there, the pattern usually deepens into something subtler, control over the narrative itself, not just what happened, but who gets to decide what happened. He doesn't just tell you his version of events, he subtly steers you away from asking too many follow-up questions, often through humor, mild irritation, or a quick change of subject. This is where lying starts overlapping with manipulation, because the goal isn't only to avoid consequences anymore, it's to maintain a particular image of himself, both in your eyes and in his own. Psychologists describe this as impression management taken to an extreme, where maintaining the desired self-image becomes more important than maintaining the truth. And this is where you might start to recognize the shape of it in your own life. Maybe not in dramatic lies, but in how certain conversations always seem to end with you feeling like the unreasonable one for asking a simple question. Before we go deeper, it's worth pausing on something that happens almost every time someone first describes this pattern to a friend or a therapist. They almost always start with logistics. They'll mention the late-night excuses that don't match the phone records, the work stories that seem to grow a little each time they're retold, the apology that arrives with a slightly different explanation than the one given an hour ago. What they rarely mention at first is the feeling underneath all of it, the specific, disorienting sensation of being told something is true while every instinct says otherwise. That gap between what's said and what's felt is usually the first real clue that this isn't ordinary forgetfulness or simple exaggeration. It's something closer to a system, quietly running in the background of nearly every interaction. Think about how exhausting that actually is to maintain, even though he rarely shows it. Keeping a story consistent across weeks, across different listeners, across moods and stress levels, takes a strange kind of mental labor.
Most people assume liars are simply careless, but the ones who do this constantly are often anything but. There's a kind of vigilance running underneath the calm exterior, a constant low-level tracking of who knows what, who was told which version, what needs to stay consistent, and what can be quietly adjusted. Defenses around, often without even realizing how elaborate those defenses have become. As we go deeper, something more uncomfortable starts to surface, which is that the lying often isn't just about deceiving others anymore. It's about managing an internal experience he can't quite tolerate. Many people who lie constantly are, underneath it all, deeply afraid of being truly seen. Not seen in the sense of being noticed, but seen in the sense of being known, flaws and uncertainties included. The lie becomes a kind of curtain, not just hiding mistakes from the world, but hiding from himself how fragile his sense of self-worth actually is. This connects closely to research on shame-based identity, where the fear isn't "what if they find out what I did?" but something closer to "what if they find out who I actually am?" This is usually the point where people watching a video like this start to feel something shift, because you may recognize that the person you're thinking of doesn't lie about big, dramatic things nearly as often as they lie about small ones, the ones that don't even seem worth lying about. And that's actually the clue. The smaller and more unnecessary the lie, the more likely it's protecting something emotional rather than something practical. Now here's where it gets even more layered, because chronic liars often aren't just protecting themselves from external judgment. They're protecting themselves from an internal narrator that's far harsher than anyone around them. Many of them carry a kind of silent perfectionism, a belief that any flaw, any failure, any normal human inconsistency will be used against them, the way it may have been used against them once before. So the lying isn't really aimed at you. It's aimed at an old, internalized voice that whispers, "You are not enough as you actually are." The compulsive need to control how he's perceived is, in a strange way, an attempt to finally outrun that voice for good. You can often spot this perfectionism if you look closely at what he actually lies about. It's rarely the things that would genuinely damage him if revealed. It's the small, almost pointless things, the exact number of beers he had, whether he actually went to the gym or just said he did, whether he really called his mother back or simply meant to. These tiny inflations and omissions don't make logical sense if the goal is simply avoiding consequences, because there usually wouldn't be any real consequence for telling the truth in the first place. But they make complete sense once you understand that the goal isn't avoiding consequence at all. It's avoiding the internal sensation of falling short, even in the smallest, most private ways, of an image he's been building and defending for most of his life. This is also where the relational cost becomes impossible to ignore, because while all of this is happening internally, something is quietly eroding on the outside: trust. Not trust in any single fact, but trust in the relationship's foundation itself. The people closest to him often describe a particular kind of exhaustion, the fatigue of constantly fact-checking someone they love, of feeling slightly unmoored in conversations that should feel safe. This isn't really about catching him in lies anymore. It's about the slow, disorienting realization that the version of reality you've built your closeness around may have never been fully stable to begin with. You see this play out in very ordinary settings across families and workplaces throughout the West. A wife who keeps a quiet mental tally of mileage and receipts, not out of suspicion exactly, but because something taught her years ago that she has to. A manager who learns to double-check a particular employee's reports against the original data, not because the numbers are usually wrong, but because they're occasionally, inexplicably, just slightly off in a way that always benefits him. An adult son who stops asking his father how he's really doing, because the answer is always fine, always upbeat, even when the rest of the family quietly knows it isn't. None of these people set out to become detectives in their own relationships. They were simply trained into it, one small inconsistency at a time, until vigilance became the price of staying close. You may have felt exactly this without having the words for it before now, that quiet unease of loving someone while also feeling like you're navigating a story that keeps rewriting itself. And underneath all of this sits the deepest layer, the one that's hardest to see because it requires looking past the behavior entirely and into the wound that started it.
Chronic manipulative lying is more often than not a learned response to a world that once felt profoundly unsafe to be honest in. It's not an excuse for the pain it causes the people around him, but it is an explanation, and those two things can exist at the same time. He learned, likely very young, that authenticity carried a cost he couldn't afford to pay, and so he built another version of himself instead, one that could move through the world without ever risking that original wound again. I think about this sometimes in terms of a child who breaks something by accident and immediately feels the air in the room change. Maybe a parent's voice sharpens, maybe there's a punishment that feels wildly out of proportion to a simple mistake, maybe love itself suddenly feels conditional in a way it never had before. A child in that moment doesn't reason it through the way an adult might. He doesn't think, this one reaction doesn't define my whole world. He simply learns on some pre-verbal level that the truth led directly to pain, and that a different version of events might have kept that pain from happening at all. Multiply that moment by hundreds of smaller variations across childhood and adolescence, and you start to see how a habit of self-protective dishonesty can quietly calcify into something that no longer feels like a choice at all. By adulthood, it doesn't feel like lying to him. It feels like breathing. When you put all of these pieces together, the fluent storytelling, the narrative control, the fear of being truly known, the silent perfectionism, the erosion of trust around him, you start to see something that isn't really about dishonesty at all. It's about a person who, at some point, mistook self-protection for survival and never quite learned how to set that armor down. So I want to turn this back toward you for a moment, because this isn't only about him. Maybe you've recognized pieces of this in someone you love, a partner, a parent, a close friend, and maybe naming it finally makes sense of years of quiet confusion. Or maybe, and this is worth sitting with honestly, some part of this felt familiar in a different direction. Maybe there's a version of you that's also learned to smooth over the truth when honesty has felt too risky. It might help to think about the specific moments in your own life when telling the truth felt dangerous rather than simply uncomfortable. Not the big, obvious lies, but the small adjustments, saying you're fine when you're not, agreeing with an opinion you don't actually hold because disagreement felt like too much of a risk, quietly editing a story about your weekend so it sounds a little more impressive than it actually was. Most of us have done some version of this, which is exactly why understanding him doesn't require condemning him. It requires recognizing that the line between an occasional protective lie and a constant architecture of them isn't really about character. It's about how much safety a person has ever felt while being fully, plainly themselves. Either way, the question worth carrying with you isn't, how do I catch the lie next time? It's something closer to, what is this protecting? And is there a way to feel safe without needing it anymore? There's still one more angle to this that we haven't fully explored yet, which is what happens when this pattern shows up not in someone else, but in the quiet, almost invisible ways we lie to ourselves, and how that self-deception often comes from the exact same root. If this resonated with you, I'd really love to know in the comments whether you recognized someone specific while watching this, or maybe recognized a smaller piece of yourself. I think conversations like that matter more than they get credit for. And if you found this helpful, a like genuinely helps this reach more people who might need to hear it too. If you want to keep exploring how the mind protects itself in ways we don't always notice, consider subscribing, because there's a lot more of this we can unpack together. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next one.